Hi, this is Kyle. Welcome to my channel. If you've watched any of my other videos before, you know that I'm not a great extemporaneous speaker. I also don't speak very quickly, which annoys people. So what I'm going to try to do in this particular video is read so that I don't bore you out of your minds and have you send me insulting emails. So this paper is about biotechnology and the Tao, or the Tao. So I'll just start right here. The hallowed halls of the humanities and social sciences continue housing lectures, holding classes, and producing texts. Line by line, precept upon precept, we go on apace. Meanwhile, advances in the hard sciences and allied fields of biotechnology, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence continue to accelerate in their rate of acceleration. Discovery, progress, and innovation are the animating forces of the biotechnology project, which continues to follow the nonlinear curve of Moore's law. Thus, we find ourselves in the midst of the greatest revolution in recorded history, and one step closer to a possible fracture in humanity. The right hand can no longer ignore what the left hand is doing. If we're to continue to thrive as a species and as centers for intellectual inquiry and discourse, engagement in interdisciplinary thought, and meaningful public debate are essential. To that end, I endeavor to juxtapose transhumanism's topos of limitless progress through technological enhancement, and C.S. Lewis's prizing of objective morality and embodied humanism. So let's start with perfectionism. Perfection. The very nature of being human reveals a paradoxical ontological status, that of a self-reflexive creature framed towards openness, full of flux, and completely incomplete. We are perfectly imperfect. Whatever else may be said about human history, it is certainly fair to say that individuals and communities from both East and West have strived to come to terms with the beauty and burden of perfection. Whether that ideal took shape and was represented in Egyptian pyramids, obelisks, the intricacies of the Incan Empire and their emperor's estate, the Confucian form of citizenship, the samurai's harmonious exactness, the Greeks and their aesthetics, philosophizing and myth-making, the Romans and the magnitude of their empire and the might of their architecture, the Polynesian night sky navigators, the theological treatises of the more recent past, or the emerging technocentrism of post-modernity. The case can be made that there was and is a theory of perfectibility always at work within us. Burke goes as far as to say that humans are indeed rotten with perfection. Michael Hyde offers the compelling rebuttal that while too much perfection may lead to rottenness, too little leads to decay. In order to reach modern conceptualizations of perfection and stave off the inevitable process of decline, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence have been offered up as a means of human enhancement. So let's think about human enhancement and delimit the scope of that for our conversation here. Due to the broad and perhaps problematic nature of a term like human enhancement, our present conversation will limit the use of that term to the following. which simply states that human enhancement is the use of biomedical technology to achieve goals other than the prevention of disease. To achieve goals other than the treatment or prevention of disease. And this is a conversation that comes up a lot in the realm of bioethics, biomedical ethics, is what counts as a treatment, what counts as an enhancement. So central to any discussion of biotechnology and its affordances is the indistinct ethical delineation of treatment, therapy, or prevention, and that of application for enhancement. From the vantage point of some scholars, it seems clear that many individuals utilize biotechnology in order to augment what is considered their, in quotes here, natural state, which is problematic, and I'll address that in just a moment. So they apply it to their body to augment their natural state, to improve their mood, their cognition, their physical and intellectual performance, as well as appearance. One needs to look no further than the daily news to see how ubiquitous human enhancement has become. Musicians routinely ingest beta blockers to improve the quality of their performances. And a quick aside here, what's fascinating about this research on musicians is that while taking beta blockers may in fact help you relax and make fewer mistakes, that it is possible to tell that a person was taking a beta blocker because overall the music has a flatter quality to it. And there's some pretty good research on that, which is fascinating, that while it does enhance one aspect, the thing that you're using it for to enhance you to play music, it sort of dulls the music a bit. Anyway, so many athletes, including children now, rely upon biotechnology to increase strength, speed, agility, and recovery. If a person were to develop an unsightly wrinkle, like many on my face today, Botox is always an option. If one were inclined to study for an exam or write an impending article, not that any of you would ever do anything like this, but psychostimulants, although illegal without a prescription, might be used to sustain concentration. Both scholars and students alike are turning to stimulants for enhanced cognitive performance. Fascinating anecdote here. My wife was in a large psychology class at a storied university in the Southeast, as researchers like to write up in their reports. And the professor asked if any of the students in the class were taking a stimulant, and if they could, please raise their hand. And then she excused everyone else in the class. I asked my wife, so what was the what was the query about? Was it just a poll and she wanted to do a follow-up? And what actually happened was, in a class of about 300 people, she had a sample size that she figured she could score a stimulant off of one of them. So she actually told them that if one of them would be willing to give her an extra Adderall, she would give them an A in the class. No joke. This is a true story. So, stimulants for enhanced cognitive performance, at least in the area of attention or vigilance. And in the case of something like modafinil, maybe it gives you some flexibility. There's some interesting studies on pilots who used modafinil versus Adderall, which can potentially make one more aggressive. So those are interesting. As this metaphysical desire for perfection, with its propensity embedded in our language, intersects with easily accessible biotechnologies, a new era of human transcendence looms on the horizon. And so, really quickly, going back to this term natural, here we're not using it unproblematically. We want to acknowledge that it's not without its problems, but here we only mean to suggest that the state of being without the application of biotechnology. Now, in light of Darwin's work in the Galapagos, the concept of evolution was applied to the up till then rather fixed notion of human being. This teleological process of constant, if imperceptible, change and continuous emergence allows for a postmodern resituating of humanity as discursively constructed, autonomous performers of multiple identities. In other words, there is no once and for all perpetual entity, no platonic ideal or concrete form, no essential quality that can be called distinctly human. By virtue of its evolutionary heritage, humanity is in the process of becoming, a process which continues to leave definitions indefinite and possibilities for transcendence limitless. So let's think about human beings for a little bit longer. Let's meditate on this for a moment. Alvin Toffler synopsizes the changing landscape of humanity by stating it this way. The biggest question facing the 21st century can be stated in a few words. What does it mean to be human? The answer to that question will affect our most basic values and moral codes. Led by influential thinkers like Drexler, Hughes, Moravec, Kurzweil, transhumanism, an evolutionary conceptualization that would further fuse humanity with emerging technologies like nano, bio, and information technologies and the cognitive sciences, it aims at this overcoming the limits of our outdated biological systems. Bostrom, the noted professor of philosophy at Oxford, posits that humanity is a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the endpoint of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, which mean beings vastly greater in their capacities than present human beings have. And I just want to say a note about transcendence for a moment. I want to acknowledge that until the Enlightenment period, transcendence had largely been considered or relegated to more of a spiritual quest or an endeavor of that sort. And so while I don't want to conflate Enlightenment thinkers as though they were a homogeneous mass, well, what I do wish to say is that we see movement away from the strict confine of religion towards a more progressive, rational, scientific method that was intended to increase the well-being of humanity. That is, to perfect the world. It's during this same period that much of what Francis Bacon stressed, that is, the merger of scholasticism and technology, began to be enacted. Now, moreover, Kurzweil purports that we will ultimately multiply our intellectual powers by applying and extending the methods of human intelligence in order to transform our frail version 1.0 bodies into their far more durable and capable version 2.0 counterparts. Through pronouncements like these, though they smack of science fiction, those closest to the matter, the likes of Bill Joy, Francis Fukuyama, Leon Kass, have taken the transhumanist assertions quite seriously. One of the major reasons for this is due to the accelerating rate of acceleration in the realms of biotechnology, which in this case would include genetics, nanotech, and artificial intelligence. A notable example here would be This trend seen in the transcribing of the human genome in just 15 years. Kurzweil notes that scientists spend an entire year describing a mere 1/10,000th of the genome. 1/10,000th. So even with reasonable anticipated advances, it seemed natural to them that it would take a century, if not longer, before the entire genome could be sequenced. It's not that those projections were wrong either. Rather, the point Kurzweil makes is that a century's worth of work was completed in far less time, due in large part to the rapid expansion of applicable technologies. In light of this fact, we might do well to pause for a moment and familiarize ourselves with this concept and the implications of exponential growth, or what Kurzweil calls the law of accelerating returns. So Kurzweil was celebrated for his feats of engineering, work in pattern recognition, and consistent ability to accurately forecast technological advancements. Notably now has been at Google for a while as one of their chief engineers. He explains that most predictions of the future, they fail to account for the rapidity of change precisely because they are based on what we consider our intuitive linear models of history. However, technological development follows an exponential trajectory. It increases by repeatedly multiplying by constant. This concept of exponential growth is easily grasped when considering the fabled story surrounding the game of chess. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but for the sake of those who may not be, I'll just repeat it. The old story goes like this. The inventor of chess demonstrated his novel creation to his king. He was so taken with his subject's prodigious efforts that he offered the man a reward of his choosing. The inventor simply asked that 1 grain of rice be placed on the first square of the chessboard, and that the amount be doubled for each ensuing square. The king, evaluating what seemed to be this meager request in what Kurzweil calls the intuitive linear mode, didn't perceive the effects of exponential growth, and he accepted the offer. The negative repercussions of this decision, it soon became all too obvious when the amount of rice the king owed to the inventor, doubling each day for 64 days. Let's express that as 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8 plus 16 plus 32, etc. You're familiar with it now because of the pandemic, no doubt. It was greater in sum and worth than his entire kingdom. And though this is it's a popular story and can be found in many places, Kurzweil makes use of it in his work, The Age of Spiritual Machines. There are other examples specifically related to exponential growth of given technologies like semiconductors. But I just wanted to make use of an anecdote that equally represented the phenomenon while not being overly technical. So in similar fashion, scholars within the humanities and social sciences, as well as society writ large, they tend to scoff at transhumanist predictions precisely because perception and unexamined intuition suggest that the future will not be altogether different from the recent past. This is in no way meant to suggest that people are unaware of the changing landscape, but it's meant to suggest that we rarely stop to connect the dots. Advances in technology open up new avenues of research and design, which reciprocally lead to future advances. However, the intuitive linear view of history is one where we compartmentalize developments as if they're isolated from one another. Take the example of Dolly, arguably the world's most famous sheep. We remember Dolly the clone sheep because she embodied the fracturing reality that scientists were actively engaging in cloning. They weren't merely debating the topic, acting and reacting to possible ethical implications. While the world considered the concept of cloning and went about the practice of everyday life, I gotta pick up my kids, I gotta pay my bills, scientists shocked the world with living, breathing, eating, sleeping woolly clone. It's not that society failed to believe scientists were capable of such feats, only that we did not intuit. We did not expect to be so quickly confronted by the material reality of the scientific endeavor. Thus, to ignore the law of accelerating returns and its exponential potential is to miss the importance of Kurzweil's warning when he states that we won't experience 100 years of technological advance in the 21st century. Gulp. We will witness on the order of 20,000 years of progress. Again, when measured by today's rate of progress, or about 1,000 times greater than what was achieved in the 20th century. On the surface of things, 20,000 years of progress sounds promising, doesn't it? Enticing even. But what do transhumanist plans for the next few decades entail? And I know that there's going to be some criticism about whether Moore's law will hold up, or Kurzweil's ironically named theory of the law of accelerating returns. There'll be people to say, will that stand up to the grand test of time? And whether it does or not is not exactly the point that I'm trying to make. The important thing here is to understand conceptually how bioengineers, technologists, and transhumanists view the trajectory of innovation. So without comprehending this fundamental notion, even if it is strictly theoretical, it limits the robustness of potential interdisciplinary engagement. In other words, we need to take it seriously, even if it doesn't ultimately turn out to be something that continues ad nauseum, ad infinitum. Even if it continues apace at our current rate, a lot is going to change, and we need to be paying attention and taking it seriously. So let's move forward with transcending biology. Here's a quote by E.O. Wilson that stood out to me. Homo sapiens, the first truly free species, is about to decommission natural selection, the force that made us. Soon we must look deep within ourselves and decide what we wish to become. That is not at all filled with hubris. Tom Knight says it this way: the program of life, the system of DNA, genes, and genomes that governs every living thing, was written 4 billion years ago. It's time to rewrite the program. While there are many proponents of the biotechnological project, each adding her or his own unique nuances and philosophical departures, transhumanists agree on some core virtues of transcending our biological limitations. So Bostrom argues that by applying advanced technology to the human being, we can realize otherwise unrealizable goals, not obtainable through low-tech means such as education, philosophical contemplation, or moral self-scrutiny. Bostrom posits that when disease-free bodies and enhanced minds are combined with radical life extending techniques, we shall come to discover values that will strike us as being of a far higher order than those we can realize as unenhanced biological human beings. But how realistic is this vision of a disease-free, perpetually youthful, enhanced being? Well, developments in genetics have allowed germline modifications in mice, rats, sheep, and the rhesus monkey. A review of genetic modifications for the enhancement of appearance, cognition, and physical performance reveals 37 references to experimental studies performed on animals. Germline genetic modifications may soon be used to target and treat genetic diseases as well as enhance genetic outcomes. In a 2009 interview, Kurzweil stated, "I and many other scientists now believe that in around 20 years we will have the means to reprogram our bodies' Stone Age software through genetic engineering so that we can halt, then reverse aging. Then nanotechnology will let us live forever." And let me clear something up about germline engineering for a second. This is a kind of genetic engineering that targets the genes in eggs, sperm, and very early embryos. So the alteration, those kinds of alterations affect every cell in the body for the resulting individual. And those things they're passed on to future generations, which makes them rather unique in that line, in that regard. So germline engineering is banned in many countries, but not in the US. Kurzweil continues by saying, already, blood cell-sized submarines called nanobots are being tested in animals. These will soon be used to destroy tumors, unblock clots, and perform operations without scars. Ultimately, nanobots will replace blood cells and do their work thousands of times more effectively. And if you're interested, that's a really fascinating, meandering path to kind of look at the studies that are being conducted on human soldiers and DARPA's projects with them and what might be possible, how we can actually make a person utilize oxygen better. Pretty amazing stuff that's going on there. So it's not as far-fetched as it may sound on its face. There really is this kind of research going on. Renowned gerontologists like Aubrey de Grey or Cynthia Kenyon and Michael Rose agree that negligible senescence is just around the corner. To that end, Kurzweil and Grossman created a 9-step program instructing others how to utilize medical and biotechnological breakthroughs in order to maximize and prolong their health long enough to make it to the coming revolution in nanotech. The promise of cheating death through incremental scientific and technological breakthroughs hangs about transhumanists' necks like an albatross. In the unfortunate event that a person experiences what Bostrom calls de-animation, there's always a backup plan: cryogenics. Kurzweil predicts that by 2045 we will have successfully transcended our biological bodies and brains. We will gain power over our fates. Our mortality will be in our own hands. He calls this point in time the singularity, which is the culmination of the merger of our biological thinking and existence with our technology, resulting in a world that transcends our biological roots. There will be no distinction post-singularity between human and machine or between physical and virtual reality. These two things are consistently getting closer and closer to the point that you won't realize where one begins and where one ends. That sort of uncanny valley is where we're getting close to. What remains of humanity 1.0? Or what Yeats described as that aged man, a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. What happens to him? What happens to us? Kurzweil believes that humanity, us, 1.0, we leave behind a legacy. Our legacy is that of overcoming limitations. This conceptualization of the future leaves something to be desired, though, doesn't it? If one were to accept the transhumanist proposition that humans will transcend our biology and live forever, what is the I or the me that remains distinctly me? For transhumanists, the essence of personhood and identity is to be found in the realm of the mind, and intelligence more specifically. Intelligence itself is more important than the materials, the bodies or the processes that give rise to it. So human intelligence is understood to be evolution's greatest gift, its greatest achievement, and the cornerstone for transcendence. Kurzweil sees a day quickly approaching where successful reverse engineering of the human brain will allow us to develop the software of intelligence that can then be placed in more powerful computational substrates. Not dealing with the latency issues like I have in free-form, just extemporaneous speaking. Give me that updated silicon chip and I won't have that buffering, that beaner going on up here. Maybe Neuralink is just around the corner and will offer some of those enhancements even sooner than we thought. At present, though, humanity is stuck with its groundbreaking work with the body. Neural implants, such as those used to help restore hearing and those used for deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's patients, continue demonstrating how versatile and adaptive the human brain really is, suggesting that the brain to machine communication, it's possible. We've seen a number of really fascinating cases. The professor there did an experiment where he hooked himself to the internet via his nervous system, and they had an arm connected in New York. So he's in the UK, the arm's in New York, and through the internet he's able to extend his hand and grab an apple in New York. So really incredible work in that regard. There's also a number of things being done at DARPA along those lines. So while it may sound a little bit like science fiction, it's important to keep in mind that these things are happening. In 2005, the government was spending quite a bit on computer-to-brain interfaces, and that number has only increased. The practical implication for these developments they're potentially staggering. Those suffering from paralysis might well be able to regain use of their limbs. There is little arguing with the transhumanist prerogative to cure humanity of its ills and maladies. This movement would see the end of all disease and suffering. But one question worth considering is, would it also see the end of the human? So let's look back to C.S. Lewis for a moment. It's here at this tenuous, controversial intersection of humanity 1.0 and 2.0 that I wish to re-engage the thoughts of C.S. Lewis. For audiences today, Lewis is a bit of an anachronism, a repository for old books, humanistic philosophy, objective morality that safely guided and restrained the world of men. We, sons of Adam. But for the purposes of this conversation, I want to focus on and foreground Lewis's works, The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, as the arguments he presents there serve as the counterbalance to the fervor of the overly technologized transhumanist perspective. First presented as a series of lectures at the University of Durham in 1943, The Abolition of Man is Lewis's defense of natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes. Before delving into the heart of the work itself, I'd be remiss if I failed to also say a brief word about the unique circumstances surrounding that talk, because keep in mind, when this is happening, the Nazi blitzkrieg had been raining down terror on England for years, and in some respects, there was no foreseeable end to the destruction. Against the backdrop of war, massive casualties, eugenics, Lewis was asked to deliver the Rydell Memorial Lectures, which are just peak. If you haven't checked any of those out, I highly recommend them. They're usually excellent. The purpose for this lectureship is to investigate the relationship between religion and contemporary thought. Lewis's sense of urgency and style of argumentation can be more easily understood in light of those particular exigencies, easy for me to say, as The Abolition of Man was a direct response to them. Also, lest Lewis fall under postmodernity's condemning charge of Christian and The Abolition of Man be ignored as narrow apologetics, he explains that though I myself am a theist and indeed a Christian, I'm not here attempting any indirect argument for theism. The particular positional argument of Christianity or spiritual origins for objective values isn't taken up in this particular work. Rather, Lewis asserts that I'm simply arguing that if we are to have values at all, we must accept the ultimate platitudes of practical reason as having absolute validity, that any attempt, having become skeptical about these, to reintroduce value somewhere else lower down on some supposedly more realistic basis is doomed. I would recommend the debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris on this point, and also some of the conversations that Brett Weinstein has had on these topics. I think that this is a key, that once you start becoming skeptical about these sort of fundamental values, what we consider bedrock, to reintroduce value somewhere else, lower down the hierarchy, it becomes incredibly problematic. So let's think about That Hideous Strength for a moment. It's the third and final work in Lewis's celebrated Ransom trilogy. Germane to our discussion here, That Hideous Strength serves as a fictional expansion of the solemn point Lewis makes in The Abolition of Man. It's essentially the abolition of man told in a narrative fashion so that it might reach and resonate with more readers. Lewis, recognizing the importance of linking the narrative to the quotidian, writes, the story had to be shown touching the life of some ordinary and respectable profession. It's about a professor, so I don't know how respectable that is, but I'll leave that for you to decide. After all, in the world of Humanity 1.0, it is regular people who do the living, working, and dying. Lewis's work clearly honors the embodiment of the humanist tradition by reverencing the mundaneness of our experience. So let's leap into his work and see what we can glean from there. The Green Book. The launching point for the abolition of man is to be found in this harbor of education. When we think about high school, if we think about it, we tend to reminisce about our own experiences. Nostalgia takes over as we recount pleasant memories. The face hues red and our blood pressure increases slightly as we re-examine our hardships. This is all well and good, but it's not the kind of thinking about that we're going to be discussing here. Lewis writes, I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks or to the education of youth in general. It's precisely here in the realm of education and in reference to an English composition textbook that Lewis begins to argue that the actual tendency of their work is not to instruct children in the proper use of language, but to recklessly inculcate them with a philosophy of absurdity. For the sake of anonymity, Lewis refers to the English text as the Green Book. He states that in that book, when children read its passages, they will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. Furthermore, it's because the student thinks she is learning about English composition that the philosophical assumptions of the writers will effectively go unchallenged, and I think we see a lot of that happening today. Lewis argues that assumptions in the Green Book, that is, that statements about values are merely subjective feelings or preferences and cannot be treated as true or false and are therefore ultimately unimportant. This sentiment becomes unconsciously embedded with students. They find themselves 10 years hence conditioned to take one side in a controversy which he has never recognized as a controversy at all. This theme is played out in That Hideous Strength as well, sounding like an odd mixture of the abolition of man and transhumanist ideology. Consider this passage from Lewis, That Hideous Strength. He says, then the real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean one that has no take it or leave it nonsense. A real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. Of course, it'll have to be mainly psychological at first, but we'll get on to biochemical conditioning in the end and direct manipulation of the brain. Those who favor rapid acceleration of the biotechnology project, many of the writers aforementioned, are actively engaged in what media effects scholars call priming, that is, framing stories in ways that more easily access areas of the brain responsible for formulating and encouraging attitudes. Transhumanists appeal to the psychological first, but as Bostrom notes, enhancements of the brain may need to be enforced at some point. From the Green Book, the student learns to become an indiscriminate critic, comfortable discrediting anything that stirs emotions as contrary to reason and contemptible. education, rather than opening up doors for future experiences, is in this context a means of excising the soul of the student. In short, education is possible of producing what Lewis calls a trousered ape and an urban blockhead. Well, what does that mean? The trousered ape is emblematic of what MacDonald, Chesterton, and Lewis considered the baseness of existence. Eating, drinking, copulating without thought of anything higher. The mantra of transhumanism is you can have whatever you wish, whenever you wish, as often as you wish. But the urban blockhead fares no better, as he refuses to think anything higher than himself. Kurzweil, if you'll permit me, he also falls within this latter category, as he shares that there is no God because we have not yet become him. Lewis shares that in his experience as an educator, most students need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. He therefore admonishes educators to look for the desert places in the souls of pupils and to irrigate them with just sentiments. The point in so doing is that, 1, it protects them from unjust sentiments, and 2, prepares them for later encounters with the principles of ethics. Mark Studdick, the protagonist in That Hideous String, is emblematic of all that Lewis tries to communicate on this point. His education had been neither scientific nor classical, merely modern, writes Lewis. For us, we might say, in our cases, postmodern. As such, Mark lacked both peasant shrewdness and aristocratic honor. Mark is also representative of the postmodern pupil today. Worse than being unprepared for ethical conduct, postmodernity requires the problematizing of ethics and conduct. In other words, our training does not teach students to ask whether something is right or wrong, but to question the presupposition that there ever was anything truly right or wrong. Lewis, drawing from this deep well of Western philosophy, urges educators to keep in mind that small doors open into much larger rooms. Children need to be taught how to rightly esteem the good, the true, the beautiful, so that when reason at length comes to him, he will respond in right action. In Lewis's estimation of history, that women and men both believed and taught until quite modern times that there was such a thing as objective morality, and that there were just or ordinate or appropriate orientations to this higher order principling of our way of life. Frost, one of the villains in That Hideous String, he disregards Aristotle's teaching as mere Iron Age conjecture, a waste of time. I also love how people use these temporally chauvinistic terms about religious orientations and perspectives. Your Iron Age God, as if there's somehow something bad about the Iron Age, that standing where we are now on the precipice of history and the future and looking back on the past, we have hindsight. They were wrong, they were ignorant, but we are not making any of those same mistakes that they might have made. I would wager that you could not today find people that could erect a Babylon Think of the wonders that came out of Babylon. Do you think you and 79,999 of your closest friends could come up with Babylon today? I don't think so. I don't think so. Frost informs Mark that when he attains real objectivity, you will recognize not some motives, but all motives are merely animal, subjective epiphenomena. Bostrom similarly boasts that transhumanism hopes to go further than the classical philosophers with perfectionistic leanings, including Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche. In other words, their teachings were fine for the human beings who were animals, but not the transcendent beings of post-humanity. Lewis, borrowing from the centuries-old Chinese conceptualization of the Tao, he defends the overarching principles of practical reason and universal truth that have both informed and shaped human conscience across time and place. The Tao represents the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes really are true and others really are false. The kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. The Tao, or the Tao, for Lewis includes Hinduism's ideas, Plato's good beyond existence, Wordsworth's understanding of that through virtue the stars were strong, the Jewish law, Confucian harmony, Lao Tzu's way which every man should tread. By showing points of cultural convergence, Lewis is demonstrating that what we in the West typically refer to as natural law actually exists. It's real. It is reality in a way. Lewis's Tao stands as a bulwark against the tide of thought that challenges objective truth, morality, and even coherent reality. In Lewisonian thought, anyone denying the Tao is irrational and therefore stands outside of the real. They fail to qualify as men without chests because they fail to qualify as men at all. Like Plato and Aeneas, the medieval theologian, Lewis believes the chest to be the seat of magnanimity, the place where values and just sentiments reside. Keep in mind, Lewis is a medievalist. He's a medieval scholar, probably one of the best that the English language has had. So I would take that and know that he had put a lot of thought into that. He wasn't just throwing it out there. This conceptualization matters. It's worth thinking about. As such, the chest mediates reason, represented by the head, and appetites, represented by the belly, and by adjusting itself to the Tao. The Green Book and its authors, however, stand outside the Tao in opposition to it, producing men without chests. There is no argument that could propel men without chests towards the virtues of the Tao. But were one able to convince them, it still remains true that no justification of virtue will enable a man to be virtuous. One must also have stable sentiments, objective values, without which the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. In a rather damning indictment against society, Lewis concludes that the very things we need more of in this world, such as selflessness, courage. Those are the very things we will not have, because outside of the Tao, there's no justification for them. He laments, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We educate our youth to believe the self-refuting absurdity of post-modernity, and we wonder at the steady decay of civil society. Look around us right now." The logical conclusion for any people who step outside the Tao and go about debunking objective morality is cultural and spiritual erosion. That hideous strength offers a narrative realization of this, as Bellbury is shown spiraling downward. The members of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE, this sounds like an acronym that was generated during the pandemic. It cannot change because they will not change. They simply do not have the heart, but they do have sunken chests. Wrath is not simply poured out upon NICE. This is important to keep in mind. Wrath isn't poured out on them. They pull judgment down on themselves. Despite the fact that the writers of the Green Book decry objective values, Lewis demonstrates the contradictory nature of their claim. Think about it. He notes that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective, else they would not have written the Green Book in the first place. We need not deduce from the authors their exact purpose in order to know that they had written a book that could persuade students to think as they do, which they must have approved of or thought valid or correct. Thus, in writing the book, they confirmed that there is something objective, something good, something objectively good for its own sake. Far from being against absolute values, the authors are absolutely against values that do not align with their own. Lewis states that this phenomenon is very usual. A great many of those who debunk traditional, or as they would say, sentimental values, have in the background values of their own which they believe to be immune from the debunking process. They offer to do society a service by eliminating morality, ordinate emotions, and cultural restraints. Modern day transhumanist ideology, in some of its variants, notice I said in some of its variants, follows suit. Because I want to be fair and say that not all variants are the same, not all transhumanist thoughts are the same. But some of them do follow suit, wishing to replace embodied humanity and all of the values that corresponded to embodied reality as out-of-date software. So certain variants of transhumanists not only desire to decommission evolution, but also the human being and its long-held philosophical, religious, psychological, and metaphysical traditions. While refuting the Tao, they hope to set up a post-human framework of non-biologically based values. For Lewis, this is impossible because, as we have seen, all the values which one uses in attacking the Tao, and even claims to be substituting for it, are themselves derived from the Tao. Transhumanists believe that non-biological values are decidedly better than those of unenhanced humanity, to which Lewis responds with a series of questions. Very, very much worth considering here. How come you to know that something is better? I hesitate when people say better. How do you know it's better? According to what? What standard? In saying that some values are better than others, are you not admitting an objective standard? What right do you have to select for yourself what portions of the Tao you wish to keep, like values, or toss away for that matter? Lewis simply does not offer wiggle room on this point. He remains fixed in the face of postmodernity and says you cannot have it both ways. If you reject any portion of the Tao, you must reject the entirety of the Tao. If you keep any portion of the Tao, you have to keep all of it. The transhumanists cannot escape this particular dialectic, I don't think. Starting outside of traditional values doesn't allow you entrance back into them. If the Tao falls, all conceptions of value fall with it. As human beings, it is true that we are unique. We're all unique. But we also share languages, cultures, genetic heritage, contexts, and perspectives through which we see the world. By virtue of our symbolic interactions and shared meaning making, to say something entirely new and to value something entirely new is rather impossible from my perspective. If one were to say something new, I mean entirely new, it would need to be said in a manner that is otherwise incomprehensible. Because if it's comprehensible, it is necessarily built upon existing structures of knowledge and is therefore not new. Similarly, if one were to value something new, it would need to be something that does not exist, else it would not be new. And how can one value something that does not exist? This is precisely why the biotechnological project and transhumanists who subscribe so strongly to it have difficulty articulating a coherent philosophy. They cannot say what they value, only that they, still as humans, do not value what humans value, which is impossible to know. Ostensibly, what they are saying is that when they enhance themselves through technology, they will then value the things that they experience irrespective of their valuableness. Lewis adeptly refutes the notion, stating, "There has never been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world." The transhumanist response is, then we'll make a new world and we will remake ourselves. Fine. But this line of argument is taken out by Lewis in the final chapter of The Abolition of Man and throughout passages in That Hideous String. I want to turn our attention to those salient points and then offer a conclusion. Lewis is careful to give honor where honor is due, noting that humanity has benefited from the scientific endeavor. In a way, prefiguring arguments made by Alvin Plantinga, Lewis would assert that science itself is not the enemy, rather a particular way of viewing the world through more of a scientistic lens, with science and technology used as instruments to aid and assist the remaking of man. Let us decide for ourselves what man is to be, Lewis writes, and make him into that, because we want him to be such. Having mastered our environment, let us master ourselves and our own destiny. The boisterousness of pronouncements like this often generate at least 3 types of responses: outright disbelief, frenzied excitement, and detached ambivalence. The first response is typified in a passage from That Hideous Strength. Was there a single doctrine practiced at Belbury which hadn't been preached by some lecturer at Edgestowe? Oh, of course, they never thought anyone would act on their theories. No one was more astonished than they when what they'd been talking of for years suddenly took on reality. But it was their own child coming back to them, grown up and unrecognizable, but their own. One of the primary purposes of this conversation that I want to have is to draw attention to the fact that we live in an era of unprecedented technological advances, but fail to take seriously the claims of those developing the technologies and those accelerating the innovations. We view the world through an intuitive linear perspective that is incompatible with exponential growth. In short, we do not believe the world as we know it will end, because it has not. As Paul Virilio implores, if we're not careful, one day the day will come when the day will not come. This is the essence of Kurzweil's singularity. He wants to see past the event horizon of humanity and is helping speed us in that direction. Now, transhumanists enact the second type of response, that is a frenzied excitement. Throughout this conversation, what I've attempted to point out is that this particular ideology is at work within the transhumanist movement, a movement that also holds with it the momentum of accelerating technology. There is such overlap between That Hideous Strength and transhumanist literature, specifically Kurzweil's works, that you could easily exchange certain passages and end up with the same themes. Whereas Lewis means his to be a cautionary tale, Kurzweil means his to be an explication of an ideology. Lewis writes, "In us, organic life has produced mind. It has done its work. After that, we want no more of it. We must get rid of it. By little and little, of course. Slowly we learn how. Learn to make our brains live with less and less body. Learn to build our bodies directly with chemicals. No longer have to stuff them full of dead brutes and weeds." Compare Lewis's thoughts to one of the many passages that Kurzweil incorporates into his vision of the future, all while keeping in mind that billions of dollars are being spent to actualize these proposals. Kurzweil says, "As we learn the operating principles of the human body and brain, we will soon be in a position to design vastly superior systems that will last longer and perform better without susceptibility to breakdown, disease, aging." One example of a conceptual design for such a system envisions features such as a meta-brain for global net connection with a prosthetic neocortex of artificial intelligence, interwoven with nanobots, solar protected smart skin that has biosensors for tone and texture changeability and high acuity senses. Although version 2.0 of the human body is an ongoing grand project that will ultimately result in the radical upgrading of all of our physical and mental systems, we will implement it one small, benign step at a time. In contrast to the excitement of transhumanists is the ambivalence of, say, a John and Jane Q. Public. Hyde and King, two experts in the bioethics debate, suggest that the general public enacts a rather passive, wait-and-see approach to matters such as the ones discussed here. In fact, there's a conspicuous lack of public discourse centered on many of these issues. As a result, what we have in America is a kind of circular immobility. Due to the public ambivalence, the government has very few policies in place that limit what kinds of alterations, augmentations, or enhancements people can apply to their own or their children's bodies. Due to governmental inaction, those with the means to enhance do enhance, while the general public watches to see what's going to happen. Ambivalence is problematic for many reasons, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to mention a couple. If we don't have regulations in place to protect the public, especially children, citizens may suffer from negative side effects or even unintended consequences that have not yet been realized. We need to look no further than what is considered routine medicine and how 100,000 Americans die each year from properly prescribed and properly administered medications. This is something that's highly regulated, yet there's a large segment of the population who are killed by means of governmentally reviewed and sanctioned therapies. My point is just that by waiting for detrimental outcomes and public outcry before instituting policies that will protect citizens, a considerable amount of lives may be lost in the process. Some of them possibly infants and children. The next is simply that if there are no negative side effects and the project to enhance the mind and the body goes exceedingly well, we have an altogether different problem on our hands. Namely, those wealthy enough to afford enhancing technologies will have access to all of these affordances, while the poor will not. While on the surface this might sound like similar arguments of stratification, the difference being that in this instance we have not just social or economic differentiation, which is challenging enough, but a genetic or biological differentiation. How then do you regulate policies to equally accommodate what might be considered a lower class, humanity 1.0, yours truly, and an upper class, humanity 2.0? This last question leads us right back to the crux of the abolition of man. When proponents of the biotechnology project and transhumanism state that we will wrest power from nature and overcome our limitations, what that actually means is man's power is, in reality, a power possessed by all men? No. By some men, which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Far from egalitarian, the endeavor to transcend humanity is actually a descent into slavery, because the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we've seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. The leaders of the biotechnology project and transhumanism instruct others as to what it means to be enhanced, how to become the post-human ideal, and they're responsible for those technologies that will be used in the coming months and years. Harriet Washington echoes Lewis's warning by informing the public of what can only be called the ownership of life. Advances in biotechnologies and synthetic biology are allowing corporations to acquire patents for their discoveries, which happen to be the essential processes of life. Kurzweil also notes that intelligence has yet to be copyrighted or patented, but that will change as patent applications have already been filed based on brain reverse engineering. What we're talking about here is unprecedented in scope. The new powers of biocolonialism will quite literally be able to make people in their own image or as they so desire. No civilization has ever possessed or owned the very right to life in this fashion. It's not difficult to imagine the coming days when we will, if we do not rethink our current trajectory, have to go through corporations in order to purchase elements of life, just like we now purchase software. If the exponential advances in technology continue following that S-curve and regular people do nothing, we will no longer reproduce children because companies will own the rights of reproduction. One artificial intelligence expert stated that by 2040, intelligent machines will far surpass the 40,000 year reign of human beings. These machines are being created today based off of reverse engineered human biology and intelligence, which, according to Kurzweil, will cause them to hold humans in positive regard. But this just isn't knowable. Although different than Lewis's conceptualization of the end of humanity, his questions remain prescient. What keeps them, intelligent machines, from making life miserable for us or even obliterating us? Why should they wish to see our species preserved? If they wish to liquidate humanity, humans have done that to other humans. It will not make them bad men, for they are not men at all. The expert advises us, don't think of us, the humans, versus them, those future uber robots. Instead, view yourself and humankind in general as but a stepping stone, not the last one, on the path of the universe towards more and more unfathomable complexity. Be content with that little role in the grand scheme of things. Hearing pronouncements like that, for Lewis, he would say that there's no question we've stepped outside of the Tao and into the void. In conclusion, although this is certainly incomplete, what I've attempted to do here is juxtapose transhumanism's topos of limitless progress through technological enhancement and C.S. Lewis's prizing of objective morality and embodied humanism. As science and technology continue accelerating and expanding in scope, moving ever forward toward new discoveries and new possibilities, again, think Humanity 2.0, it's more important than ever that we engage in robust dialogue with one another. This serves as a reminder of the richness of being Humanity 1.0. As Freud, McLuhan, Postman, Illouz, Arendt, and countless others remind us, technological innovation often creates its own new set of problems, euphemistically deemed unintended consequences or negative externalities. The intuitive linear mode of thinking assumes that life will continue as it has in the past. The exponential model demonstrates that fractures can occur seemingly out of nowhere and carry with them life-altering implications. So we find ourselves at the intersection of humanity 1.0 and humanity 2.0, at the intersection of being and becoming. This is a contemporary moment that affords us a great opportunity to do ourselves and the world a bit of good. Failure to take the transhumanist movement seriously would be a grave error on our parts, and perhaps our last. And notice, for that to happen, no one needs to have malign intentions. As I just stated, there could just be negative externalities that we haven't contemplated. With each new technological advancement, it seems as though the window of opportunity closes a bit more. Though Kurzweil estimates that the singularity will not occur for another 3 decades, it doesn't follow that life as we know it will remain unchanged until that time. We need look no further than the growing number of cyborgs around us, those constantly attached to their cell phones, iPads, laptops, to see that change is imminent. For Lewis, this isn't about money, power, or a particular group of people who hang in the balance. It is everything that we call human, that we call home. I know this was long, and probably even doing reading instead of extemporaneous speaking off the top of the dome. Maybe not my best, but it's at least a challenge that I'm excited to do, and trying to get some of these ideas out there. I'm really open to where you disagree. Again, I think that dialogue is crucial here. Taking public concern seriously, it's all part of the process. And so maybe you are part of, say, a Christian transhumanist movement, and you disagree with my reading of Lewis and my reading of other transhumanists. There's certainly an argument to be made against what I've put forward here, and I'm open to that, and I would love to hear what comments you have, or for you to come and let us reason together. Because off the top of my head, I know that there are interpretations of be perfect as I, God, am perfect. There are interpretations of that, and passages, even Jesus' own words, for instance, greater things will you do now that I've gone to the Father. What are those greater things? Healing the lame, causing the blind to see, opening deaf ears. These are all things that technology, again, does allow to happen. And in our current context during the pandemic, one of the things that we hope will arrest it is the introduction and wide-scale adoption of vaccines. That's a biotechnology. And so you can see that there are really great things on offer, and I could see how one could extrapolate from there that this is the Lord's work. And again, I'm open to that argument, and I think someone could put it forward in a great way, and I'd entertain it. I would at least dialogue with you about it. So this is me signing off. Thanks so much for your incredible indulgence. All 12 of you, 9 of whom are no doubt Russian bots.